Thank you everyone for coming on a very rainy mountain day. So today we are hosting Professor Stephen Saideman. He holds the Paterson Chair in International Affairs at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. He previously was the Canada Research Chair in International Security and Ethnic Conflict at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. So, as you may already know, most of his research has focused on the international relations of ethnic conflict, including his first and second books. The first was what was titled The Ties That Divide, Ethnic Politics, Foreign Policy and International Conflict. And the second is For Kin or Country, Xenophobia, Nationalism and War. And I think this led to some projects on the comparative politics of ethnic conflict, as well as interest in the dynamics of intra-state conflict in general. So Professor Saideman spent 2001-2002 on the US Joint Staff working in the Strategic Planning and Policy Directorate as part of a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship. And now he's completing a book on NATO's experience in Afghanistan, while also continuing his work on the international relations of ethnic conflict by focusing on the dynamics of diasporas, which is the topic of today's talk, I think, right? So it is titled Diagnosing Diasporas, a comprehensive effort to understand variations in mobilization and extremism. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation again, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. I appreciate the chance to present my research here. I need to be as clear as possible that what I'm presenting today is about as preliminary as you can get. It's more of a research design than a research product. The past few years I've been more focused on the project that you mentioned on NATO and Afghanistan, which is mostly about how do countries control the militaries in distant lands. This returns back to my more traditional work, which is why do countries take sides on people's ethnic conflicts. And in the course of that research, diasporas frequently came up as a topic. Questions raised about the Hungarian Americans being seen as being a problem for Hungarians, whether those are Hungarians in Hungary or Hungarians in Romania, but they were seen as being naive, romantic, lost in the past. But what really motivates this project is that diasporas are poorly understood, that in the world we have many segments of peoples who've left their home country, moved to a new place. Most of the research that we see in this area focuses on the most visible cases where those segments become mobilized, organized, politically relevant, and often extreme, that they support violence. So if you read works of diaspora, the tendency in political science literature anyway, is to emphasize Jewish Americans, Irish Americans when they used to be supporting violence in Northern Ireland, Cuban Americans. You notice there's an American-centric kind of approach to a lot of the diaspora work. Although Tamil Canadians have gotten a lot of attention for supporting the Tamil Tigers. Armenians in a variety of places. And what we haven't seen are the dogs that haven't barked. I'm actually citing Sherlock Holmes. That in my previous book on irredentism, I was very careful exploring, or to look at cases where irredentism did happen, which would be Armenia, Croatia, Serbia, where irredentism could have happened. Greater Russia, Greater Romania, Greater Hungary. Well, in the diaspora literature, there's the same problem of focusing on the most visible cases, and so we don't really know what causes some diasporas to mobilize, while others do not. So that's the essential notion. It leads to having a very big ambition, because you have to study things that haven't happened. You have to study groups that may exist but haven't really organized as groups, or groups that have organized but have not put forth a really strong political agenda, or groups that have organized with a really strong political agenda but haven't actually supported violence. So it's a big task, and the basic idea of this project with Kathleen Cunningham at Maryland and Aaron Jenny at Central European University is to try to code all diasporic segments in the developed democracies, and see, that way we can figure out whether variations amongst democracies matter. Presidentialism versus parliamentarism, federalism versus not federalism, different kinds of laws regulating immigration, different histories of immigration, different lengths of history about immigration, whether those cross-national variations might matter. However, that's really hard to collect data in all these different segments around the world. And again, we're just restricting it to advanced democracies. That's essentially Western Europe, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. If we find ourselves actually being really productive and getting lots of money, then maybe we can expand it to other countries. Thus far, all we've done is the United States, and we're not quite done with the United States. The good news is the United States is going to be the hardest country to code, really. Even though the resources of information are good, there are just so many groups that have emigrated to the United States. Japan will be very easy to code, by contrast. May save that for last as an easy. Okay, Japan. All right. Now the status is that we're mostly done in the United States. I think we may be done. I've got to talk to my coders in the next couple weeks when I go back to Montreal, where I left them behind when I moved to Ottawa, and figure out where we stand. But we should be done with the United States case. And what we'll try to do is publish off the United States case, and then code the Canadians and the Brits, and so on. And so hopefully we'll start seeing output sooner than later. What we mean by a diasporic segment is any ethnic group that has immigrated is a potential diaspora. So again, ethnic groups. What is an ethnic group? Well, we have definitions all over the place. What we're doing is we're taking the data set that Fear and Leighton had, where they published a variety of pieces on what counts as an ethnic group and whatnot. And we took that list and then shrunk it down to around 250, 280, because not every group that is an ethnic group in the world is present in the United States. And the other challenge is they may not identify as that group that was listed in the FAIRN data set. It may be that 2 or 3 different groups that are listed in the FAIRN data set all have a shared identity. Whether that's Kurds or I'm trying to remember some of the other ones that we put together, but if you went through country by country, you'll find that there's a bunch of groups that there's a challenge in building any data set based on something as malleable as ethnicity, is that there's always multiple identities. And so we've had to figure out which one do we think is the right level. Anyway, so that's the first thing. That's what we're looking at. Mobilization. Is a sizable portion of the diaspora engaged in politics? Are they organized around ways that deal with their homeland? We find and we code groups that just have dance organizations. We know it exists in the United States because they've organized to have dance or music from their homeland in the United States. We know they exist, so that's important. Because we want to see what groups that exist, but then don't mobilize. So if we can see whether they exist, but for us the question then becomes, do they self-identify? Do they have political organizations? Do they have media? One of the challenges has been what counts as media these days, because it used to be, wow, this diaspora had a radio station or a radio program. That's evidence of them really trying hard. Or they had newspapers. Lots of diasporas were ranging. Some would have 1 newspaper, some would have 150. And so, since we're trying to code from roughly, I want to say, in the Cold War to 2010, we emphasized more traditional media. These days, it's very easy. We can just go online and go, okay, this group has a web page. Does that really count as anything? Well, it could just be some kid in a basement posted a web page. That doesn't really require political mobilization. But so we're going to have to figure out, if we continue to do this, about how to count that kind of stuff. Do they lobby? Do they approach politicians? Do they have lobbyists? Do they have a lobbying organization? How extensive are their lobbying efforts? And then what are they demanding? Are they trying to fund violence back home? Are they sending guns and money and mercenaries back to Kosovo, back to Croatia, back to wherever? So that's the basic idea of what we're trying to do, is to try to get information on this. The question then becomes, what do we think matters? What are the theories? So first of all, I'll present a few of the alternatives, then I'll present the one that we're arguing. Some of the literature out there argues that diasporas in the host country are more concerned about maintaining themselves, maintaining their identity. And so activity towards the homeland is more about them, is self-centered, it's not other-centered. It's not about but we really care about the Jews in Israel, or we really care about the Tamils in Sri Lanka, or whatnot. It's about maintaining one's own identity. So we consider, in terms of for this hypothesis, how important is it to protect your identity, or how distinct are you? With a basic idea that if you're less distinct ethnically, you'll actually have to be more engaged in foreign policy to try to prove that you exist. So we code groups on whether, how are they white or not white? Are they Christian, not Christian? This will change from country to country, but in the United States, the average person still more or less is white and Christian. Also, were you forced to immigrate? Because that might have an important effect. Because if you're forced to immigrate, that probably shapes your policy preferences than whether you just voluntarily left for economic purposes. On the one hand, it means your identity is pretty strong. On the other hand, it means that you actually have motivation. So it could go in either direction, but we want to take a look at that variable. The second argument is it's mobilized not by threats to you as an individual in your host country, but are the kin in danger? The diasporas will be responding to threats to their kin. So it's more likely to have the Tamils will get more activity because, and particularly towards the end, you'd think, because of the threat they faced of mass killings and repression by the Sunni majority. So there's all kinds of variables that we're building into the data set that will focus on, are the kin abroad in danger? For instance, when I was looking at air dentism in Eastern Europe, it was pretty clear the Hungarian Americans and Hungary in general were spending a lot more time talking about the Hungarians in Romania and Slovakia, particularly times where Romania and Slovakia were developing policies that were fairly repressive of those minorities. And then they started talking more about the Serbs, the Hungarians in Serbia. They never spent much time talking about Hungarians in Austria, the United States, other places. So the focus was on the Hungarians that were in danger. So anyway, so one possibility could be that it's the threats. What our argument essentially is that there's always going to be people in these groups who are concerned about their Hungarians for one reason or another, whether they can are in danger or not. But whether they become organized will depend on their capacity, on the structure of the political system, on the structure of their ethnic group. Are they wealthy? Are they politically concentrated? Every study of ethnic conflict within countries shows that group concentration matters. That groups that are concentrated are more likely to engage in violence. So does that matter for the international relations of it? Does a concentrated group more likely to have people talking to each other, convincing each other how important their kin are, and organizing rather than being dispersed? How much autonomy do they have? This is a real important question, because when we speak about the Tamil Tigers, or the Tamils in Canada, that's probably a Freudian slip. When we speak of Tamils in Canada, the real question was, how independent are they from the Tamil Tigers? Because there were protection rackets in Toronto, where young Tamil males would knock on doors and say, you care about your kin abroad, right? Give money. There was a similar dynamic in New York, 97, 98, where the Kosovo Liberation Army was trying to raise money as well, that the Albanian community in New York faced some pressure. Another variable is distance. And right now, because we're just looking at the United States, we can't really test for these too much, because most groups are similarly distant. But in the institutions of the host, that's the United States, for the first run analyses, it's not going to vary. Our ambition is to be able to test that. That requires a lot of work. We've done some analyses. I'm not going to show you much of it at all, because the data that was based on has changed a lot. This is before amalgamation. It was only a third of the data set that had been collected. It was pretty interesting, but we have no clue as to, it has less substance than whatever poll we hear about, being run by the Republicans about how successful Romney's doing today. So what we did kind of find is that preservation, that is trying to maximize identity, mattered less than capacity. But we don't really know. So what we need to do is finish the data set, which we're close to being done doing, and then build, and we've been building in the variables for distance, for the danger of the kin, And what we need to do is add more countries. As I said, we'll probably do Canada next because we probably can get money from the Canadian government to study these diasporas because they understand that these are ethnic groups that are engaged. Some of them are engaged in transnational networks that might include financing, might include guns, weapons. And so there's a security interest on part of the government, so we can perhaps get some grant money that way. And then again, we'll go on and on and on. So this is the biggest, most ambitious project I've pursued. So we'll see. Eventually we'll publish pieces of it. Hopefully we'll get to the end of it. But I wouldn't expect the book for another 5 or 10 years, which means I got to focus on other things in order to look like I'm productive. What do we need to do? Well, the first thing we need to do in this, besides completing all the data, is we need better theory, because in our initial results, it seemed to be the case that when we use dependent variables that focus on mobilization, we often got different results than when we focus on extremism. So there might be dynamics, forces, factors that cause groups to mobilize, but not mobilize in terms of extremism. And so we need to think through why that might be the case, because usually when we have multiple variables, we think that our core hypotheses all produce the same sort of reaction, whether it's showing up in a big size, showing up with guns. Whether that's any state of the conflict, usually we'll think of, more is more, not different. So there is a suggestion, at least in the first analyses, that there are hints of different dynamics. That being violent or supporting violence is distinct from just showing up and having protests or just having organizations. So that's something we got to think about. We're finishing the U.S. case. We'll go to the rest of the Anglosphere, just so we have a nice common group of countries that have similar institutions, similar experiences. And 3 out of the 4 are immigrant countries. Well, actually, the 4th is 2, but not really. I mean, lots of immigrants in the United Kingdom, but Canada, Australia, and New Zealand fundamentally run by immigrants. So we'll see if that makes a difference. And then once we do that, we'll add in Europe, and as I said, Japan. Because again, the time span is basically from, I think, from 1990 to 2010. It might actually go a little bit into the Cold War. I haven't been eyeballing the data as carefully as I should be, because right now they're coding other stuff. So this is what I got. I'd be interested in hearing your feedback about this, because as I said, it's a very much project in motion. And I got the invitation to come here last week, so I couldn't whip up anything fancier than this. So let me know what you think about this, and perhaps you can help me fix the problems before they get too big.
Thank you very much. We more or less half an hour for questions and answers. If you have questions, please. Yes.
Stephen, can I ask 2 points of clarification?
Sure.
So first of all, your groups, are you putting together, for example, Hungarians? When you look at Hungarians in America,
Yeah.
are these Hungarians from like all different countries, and they constitute one group? So Hungarians from Hungary as well as Hungarians from Slovakia?
Yeah, that's the tricky thing, is how do we do that?
Yeah.
And in general, we do distinguish between the Hungarians from, actually, in the first rounds we distinguish between the Hungarians from Hungary and the Hungarians from beyond Hungary. I want to say the way we've coded it now, what we're counting are only the Hungarians in the diaspora, not the Hungarians in Hungary, because the mobilization would not be about trying to help the Hungarians in Hungary. The
Hungarians in the U.S.
are mobilized into political activity that's directed at the Hungarians in Romania, Slovakia, Ukraine, all those. So those would all be bundled into one category, or one dyad. Hungarians in the United States, Hungarians in the around, but not in Hungary.
Because the second question was when you're looking at capacity, for example, when you say institution of the host, what do you mean by
So this would be the institution in the United States institutions, right?
Okay.
So in the end, we'll have variation. Right now, we don't.
Okay.
But one of the questions is almost all the literature on the foreign policy dynamics of diasporas is about the United States, which means that everybody's dealing with the same battleground. That is Congress, campaign finance is the same way, elections every 2 years, federal system, all those kinds of things that might empower diasporas in the United States, but might make them irrelevant in a country where parties matter a whole lot more and individual representatives matter a whole lot less. So, for instance, in Canada, in a lot of ways, individual members of parliament don't matter politically, and trying to lobby one individual member of parliament is not going to have the same kind of impact as influencing John McCain. So what we want to do ultimately is compare the institutions of the host, because we think that should matter in empowering. One thing we may build in, but we haven't done thus far, is code where the home country is, where they came from. Is it democratic or is it not democratic? Because one could imagine that you're not going to lobby as much to anticipating some comments. Because you might not be as concerned about the plight of your relatives in democracies, although we found that democracies can repress ethnic groups. So they're not immune, so we would still want to keep in variables about repression. That's something I think.
I mean, just on the same, and then autonomy, when you're looking at autonomy, so for example, the Hungarians, you talk about autonomy where?
Okay, yeah, I ran through this very quickly. Autonomy means, is the diaspora in the United States autonomous from the homeland? You would think that most diasporas have nothing to do with the homeland. Certainly they're active to it, but not controlled from the homeland. But there's reasonable suspicion that the Tamil diaspora, for instance, in Canada, was mostly organized and run by the Tamil Tigers. We're trying to understand whether you're mobilized going home, in the host to direct your activity to the home country, but we've got to control for the possibility that some groups are not going to have agency, or not much agency, because they're more or less the creatures of their whatever groups that are in the homeland.
But there is an issue, and there might not be a single homeland. I mean, many of the diaspora groups,
Yes.
Armenians come from, all the former Soviet republics.
That's right.
Hungarians come from.
Yes.
I mean,
And this has been a real problem for us, because if we, this just shows why this project is so very hard. Because the trade-off is that if we amalgamate all the Armenians in the United States, it means that we can't, how do we figure out what they're reacting to? Are they reacting to events in Azerbaijan, Armenia, Turkey, wherever? On the other hand, this is the real challenge we got. We started doing it the way that you were imagining, but then we had to change it, because how do you find the Turkish Armenians in the United States versus the Armenian Armenians versus the Azerbaijani Armenians? That was impossible to code, ultimately. So in the end, it's going to be mostly about our diasporas could mobilize if, and then for the variables about the homeland, it's going to be if they have multiple homelands. So it's the highest value, the greatest risk. So if they have 4 homelands and one of them is in fire, then we're going to expect them to be more mobilized than if there's 4 homelands and all of them are kind of difficult but not as dangerous. And those variables we can look at in multiple ways, whether it's an average of all the homelands or the maximum. We'll look at it a couple different ways, because we don't theoretically have a good theoretical reason to think that 3 countries who are at a 5 level of rebellion is to be better, we get more or less activity than one country that's at a 9. Make up numbers, but if you get the idea, the basic notion is that when you combine all these home. I hate when they have the same first letter. All these home countries have varying levels of violence. How do you combine that into one thing? But we had to, because ultimately coding the diasporas in the host became impossible in terms of trying to figure out, okay, these are the Armenians from Azerbaijan. How do we know that? Some groups will self-identify that way, but most won't. The other problem was you had groups that were, we were looking for Sikh Indians, but a lot of them were just joining Indian organizations. So we had to figure out which ones were really diasporas and which ones had already sort of identified with a broader identity. Again,
imagine this may be nonsense, so feel free to shoot me down. And I'm not sure this even actually makes sense. But how do you deal with internal diasporas? So I'm thinking, just looking at the case, what you have there, Quebecois and other French Canadians in Canada, Welsh, Northern Irish and Scots in the UK, the Basques in Spain and France, and so on. Is that something that can be picked up by this?
No. We could, and I would say we probably do code Basques in the United States. Basques in the United States towards towards Spain. We would code Basque Canadians, Basques in France towards Spain. Basque, once we go country by country, there'll be plenty of Basques to code, but we would not be coding Basques in Spain towards Spain, because that we're trying to understand foreign policy. We're trying to understand international relations. And while the internal diasporas would like to think of that as international relations, it's not for our purposes.
Sorry,
So
the Basques in France are not diasporas. They're not diasporas. They've never moved.
Well, that's a good point. I was just throwing that out, but the groups that had moved, or groups that had been formed by not moving, but like the Hungarian case of the boundaries moving under them, we count those.
But those are not diasporas. I mean, that's a completely different concept that we're talking about. You're talking about minorities. I mean, you're talking about national minorities or whatever. I mean, you're not talking diaspora. You are looking at groups that have moved. That no longer there's been.
They're no longer the homeland, and so I want to say that.
Or they've moved to the borders of.
That's a good question. Again, I've been focused on other projects. I can't give you 100% certainty on this. We haven't done, it hasn't been relevant because we're talking about, right now we're just thinking about the American cases. So, the only ones that would matter for that would be Native Americans or Mexican Americans. And we're not coding Mexican Americans as being, well, they're diaspora, but they're not, folks in Mexico. Anyway. But yeah, I think we have a fairly broad definition of diaspora, so I think it probably does include cases where the boundary moved. Because they are no longer a part of the homeland as defined by international relations, by boundaries. This is something that actually we'll probably have to go through and make sure we get right, because we can certainly do it both ways. This is why I present this stuff. Okay. Because there might be different dynamics. There might not be different dynamics. So we could that's something we could easily code, and then run the analysis with them out, and see whether, as people conventionally define diasporas, is that different than if we throw in all these groups where were made diasporas by international treaties. Thanks.
Well, I think that in the case where they're made diasporas, I think it depends, because the first theory is based on self-identification, right? So if a group has stayed in the same place, but the boundary has moved on them, if they now identify with the new country, then they would be a diaspora identified as definition. So I don't know if you're looking at that too, because they might, like Polish people in Germany might self-identify as German and Polish, and then you would have, even though the border moved on.
Yeah, no, this is one of the challenges of trying to, as we're coding each group, try to figure out, okay, who do they identify with? And so we do a fair amount of research to figure out, do they perceive themselves as being X? So again, in the case of various groups that we thought would identify as being some specific unit that is from India, but not consider themselves Indians, but the more we study those groups, in the United States, they consider themselves Indians first rather than being Bengalis or whatever identity you can think of. And so that was a real challenge for the coding, was trying to figure out, okay, how much evidence do we need to figure out where they're identified? And again, it's not, in any group, you might have 75 or 80% of people identifying as X, and 20% were no, or Y. And that's a challenge for us. But we try to be sensitive as we're coding the data set from year to year, but it's a real challenge.
And along that same, what you just said, I think it seems like it would be hard to quantify or code preservation versus capacity when it comes to mobilization, because what if you feel very strongly, passionately, ideologically that you're X, but you don't have the capacity to mobilize in that way.
Well, when we think about preservation, we're thinking about threats to their identity. So, are there changes? When do you come over? Is there a new wave of immigration that's going to cause you not to have to worry about your identity? Because suddenly you have a group of your brethren who've come across, and they're all threatened, and so everybody. Albanian Americans didn't have their identity threatened in 1999. They didn't have to worry about that because suddenly there's more immigrants, and they're all being reminded of what their identity is. So it's not an identity preservation. So I think in terms of the coding of it, when we think about preservation, we're thinking about how distinct you are, and compared to the average American. Again, some things are fairly constant. As the average member of the group, were they forced to leave? These are things that are kind of static. One thing that does change is time since departure. So we expect groups that have been in the United States in this round, Canada the next round, so forth. 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years. In some ways, you expect the older groups to be more mobilized, both because they have. It'll be hard to tease out because they have more capacity. They've been around longer. They probably moved up from the immigrant class to middle class and have more resources to fund administrative assistance, to have organizations that are robust, versus groups that just came across so they don't have that. So I mean, there's some things that can push in different directions, and we've got to try to tease that out.
How do you handle waves of immigration? If you've got a group that's been around for 100 years, but people keep arriving every 20 years?
We have multiple variables, one for when they started and one for the most recent, and then we could run both, and then we can run interactions. I'm dreaming for the day where we actually try to tease these things out. Right now it's just collecting the data. But yeah, that's an important thing, is because you would expect that an organization that has had multiple waves to be much more organized and probably much more supportive of violence than the one that's been around forever and has gotten used to it in the United States and become, or in the next case, Canada, whatever. But have become assimilated, versus a group that just came across, and so they're really interested, but they might not have the capacity. So it might be that some of these arguments, I put up 3 stylized arguments that are in opposition, but there might be some interesting interactions between identity and capacity.
Are you looking at also how integrated the host country is? Because certain countries, for example, like France, is a lot less willing to have different groups as compared to Canada. So, like, how does the host country treat their institution?
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, this is one set of institutions we have to look at. It's not just about federal. I come at it from a sort of a standard set of expectations about what allows lobbying. So that would be about parliament, it would be about campaigning finance, those kinds of things. But also, what are the regulations on immigration? If, for instance, you're a country that it's very hard to become a citizen, that would affect your capacity. Are you coming from a country, is it a country, or you're a diaspora that can return home? If you can return home easily, that probably diminishes your interest in mobilizing. Because why sink so much effort in organizing in the United States or Canada or Australia when you're going home in 5 years anyway? One thing we try to think about was remittances. There's a lot of data on remittance, but it's not yearly. And you either study something 1 year and hope that that's a typical year, or you study a couple slices, but we got to think about that as well. So, but yeah, absolutely, those kinds of regulations, and I've got to have my co-authors work on that because I know nothing about immigration regulations. But once we start doing country-by-country comparisons, and also when things change over time, so if the United States changes its immigration policies, which it does every however often, that might matter as well.
Are you also taking into account home regulations? So, diasporas are allowed to return home.
Yeah.
They can only return home if they toe the government line. So it might be less politically active than they would be.
Exactly. If they can't go home, or if they can only go home if they've sworn never to speak up, then that would probably lead to more mobilization in the host country. So that's something we have to figure out as well.
You might be able to capture that by looking at whether the group has their ethnic kin is in power. You know, if they have a homeland to go to, or if they're also minorities.
Yes, no, that's something we got to think about as well.
Like the Tamil Tigers don't have there was no Tamil Tigers.
There is no homeland for them anymore. No.
So it's
So good news is our study stops before it happened. But that's something we have to think about. Is that there? Again, we have some indicators for what the condition of the homeland is. But the end of the political movement that they're supporting is as well something we had considered before, because movements usually just don't go away. The IRA is still around. So the question for me would be really, are we considered Tamil Tigers no longer in existence in 5 years, or will they reemerge? I'm skeptical that they will have gone away forever.
With the Kurds, for example, homeland. So, I mean, unless you consider, for example, the autonomous region in Iraq as a potential destination for them.
Yeah. No. So the question for us would be, at least in this study, okay, we've coded all the ones. How would we code that potential homeland? Is that means that the average safety of the Kurds has increased because they're now safe in Iraq, in Kurdistan.
Not Syria.
Yeah, again, this gets to we can code based on per country. So if there's 5 potential homelands and 4 are now safe, but 1 is still Syria, then chances are, the agenda of the Kurdish Americans, Kurdish Canadians, the British Kurd associations, their agendas will have changed. They're now more focused on Syria than Iraq, but they might. Now, of course, there's other things going on, there are other things that we haven't been able to capture, which is that maybe the predominant British associations are mostly from the Kurds from Iraq, and so they don't care about the Syrian Kurds. And that's something we can get at.
Can I just add one?
Yeah.
Group cohesiveness might help you do that. How cohesive the group is. You might be able to...
What?
How cohesive the group
Oh,
is.
yes.
So, for example, the Hungarians, if there's a lot of multiple levels of identity, you might be able to just code it in terms of group cohesiveness. With the Kurds, there's a lot of difference between Kurds, depending on where they come from. So if you still choose to look at Kurds as one group, then maybe you can somehow code the cohesiveness and not capture that somehow.
Yeah, we have that because we have been tracking our amalgamation effort. And so when we've taken a group from 10 or different pieces of other countries, then we have that data, so we can use that to say, okay, those groups that we've done this to, are they going to be similar or different from the kind of groups that are clearly Cuban Americans? We didn't have to do anything to the Cuban Americans. They're from Cuba. There's nothing, we don't have to think about Cuban Americans from, Haiti. They're Cuban Americans, pretty straightforward. So that's something we can do.
Regarding these groups' potential radicalization, because I've understood that your research will also focus on the causal relations between mobilization and extremism. Do you intend to include in your research the question of whether these groups' radicalization will be on the left part of the political spectrum or on the right one? Because in Europe we can see now that it's a phenomenon of the rise of the extreme right political groups. And I was wondering if these groups are correlated to the right extremism.
I think in the end, I know we're not collecting that data now. I think we probably will not collect that data. What we do have is we consider whether a diaspora is plugged in, got really good relations with one party or another within the host country. So if the party, if a diaspora is really plugged into the Democrats, we note that, and that might suggest something. But in terms of what the political shades are in the host country, whether it's an emerging right-wing government or left-wing government, we don't get into that. Because left-wing governments, we have variables again for repression, for other things that the governments are doing that are generic. Right-wing governments, left-wing governments can both engage in repression. So that's an interesting question. Would be, are diasporas going to be sensitive in their political activity to which party is in power in the homeland? And I guess, because, again, we're constrained by the exercise, how many things we're looking at. It's not something we capture directly, we have to capture it indirectly.
Are you looking at when a group is like temporarily in a neighboring country because of a war, and then they mobilize in that country as a so-called diaspora to fight back? And then if you are, then the indicators that you have so far, like political participation in the host country, if they have media, etc., are kind of nullified because they're there for, you know, like this period of months. And how are you looking at that at all?
I would say that in general, no. Those, if they're just temporary, I mean, then we probably don't capture them in the data set. But that's something we have to pay attention to, because what is temporary ends up being not so temporary. So if we were to code, for instance, and we're not going to, but if we were to code, let's say, Lebanon or Jordan, we would definitely say that there are diasporas in those countries that were supposed to be temporary, but haven't been. And we would code up diasporas, even though, you know, there's some of them are ones where the borders changed, and some of them are ones where they fled. We won't run into that problem too much because we are focused only on advanced democracies. And as a general rule, advanced democracies are not next to conflict zones. There's sort of a causal relationship in that, but if we include Turkey, that's when we'll have a problem. But every other advanced democracy I think of isn't bordering a conflict. Don't get me wrong. Probably is.
Maybe like Australia or Cambodia.
Yeah,
Maybe you could count that.
Yeah, no. If you go to Australia, from Cambodia, you're a diaspora. Yeah, and then there's like you can't, you know, as a base of operation, Australia's pretty lousy. Because it's not the same kind of thing as like Rwanda and the DRC, or.
But you're not looking at those.
But we're not looking at those countries, so we're saving ourselves some problems by having some limitation on this ambitious project. We're not looking at every country on the planet. So.
Just as a thought, are you going to be looking at competition? So, which could go either way. Either they be, you know, the Congress is being captured by the Armenian lobby, or, you know, and so there's no looking, or the Armenian lobby is there, so the Turkish lobby has to get going. Is that something you're able to look at?
We have variables that say whether a group is aligned with a party. But we're not going to be able to say, okay, the Armenians are aligned. Let's say the Armenians are aligned with Republicans, which I believe they are. We're not going to have in that line of data anything about whether the Turks are also subject to a party. So we can't really capture that. I think we have data. We have codes for whether the group is there, whether there's competition between the groups. Mm-hmm. Again, it goes back to the cohesive question. Is there the representation cohesive or is it competitive? Because you can imagine an ethnic outbidding dynamic. If you've got two different groups trying to represent the diaspora, they may outbid each other to be the best, most sincere, most extreme supporter of their homeland.
Right.
We're doing more than they are. They're just casual Kurds, or they're just fake, but we're the real ones because we just ship 3 tanks. But in terms of offsetting, this is an important question for effectiveness. Mm-hmm. It may be also important for mobilization, but I'm not so sure. But for if we were looking at effectiveness, one of the interesting things about the Yugoslav wars is that the American Congress was getting hit constantly by Serb Americans, Croatian Americans, and Muslim Americans. And so every congressperson would look at the district and figure out, okay, they offset each other. I can't do anything right, I'll just stay out of this. Or maybe I just had one. So there's some Congress people who were clearly from Serb district. They're the only minority that existed from that conflict were Serbs. So they took a strong line. But yeah, they can offset. But I can't really get it done.
Okay, then if there is no more questions, we are finishing. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for coming. A very good, interesting presentation.
Thanks for your feedback. It was all very valuable. I will talk to my co-authors.